My name's Robin, and I'm the Associate State Director for Community Outreach with AARP Nebraska. Today, we're going to visit with Sarah Browning from the Nebraska Extension Office, who's going to demonstrate for us how to bloom with color in Nebraska. Now, choosing plants that will thrive under our specific landscape conditions can be a challenge. We're going to learn from Sarah how to choose annual and perennial plants that will grow well in our gardens for either sun or shade in our Nebraska landscape. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you for joining us today. I want to tell you we're looking forward to hearing what we can plant in Nebraska.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to AARP for inviting me to do this program. It's really my pleasure to be with you today. So we're going to be talking about annuals and perennials that grow well in Nebraska gardens. And I'll just start off with this picture that you see right here on the screen. This is a Helenium autumnal, and this actually has the unfortunate common name of sneezeweed. Not a very pretty common name, but it can be a very pretty perennial to put in in a garden. There are lots of different hybrids types of Heleniums. Obviously, this one is a beautiful kind of a reddish orange color with those beautiful central eyes, but they can be a great accent in a garden. But before we start talking about the different plants that you might want to choose for your garden, let's just talk for a couple of minutes about managing the garden. Because if a garden is not managed well, it can give you problems and it can be disappointing, not as beautiful as you would want it to be. And, we all have very busy lives. And so trying to reduce the amount of time that you have to put into keeping your garden looking good and keeping it well maintained is important. So this is a good time of year now in the spring before we really get off into another growing season and think about what plants did well for you in your gardens last year and what plants didn't do well. Now here in this picture, we have a coneflower that is pretty badly infected with aster yellows. And aster yellows causes the flowers to be deformed. They don't bloom properly. They oftentimes never color up the way they should. They stay green, just exactly as you see the flowers in the picture. So if you had plants that were infected or by a disease or had some kind of a problem last year, maybe you had some roses that had powdery mildew very badly, or maybe you had some roses that were just totally eaten up by Japanese beetles. You might want to think about getting rid of those plants that are giving you problems. Just get them out of your garden and try something new. There are so many different types of plants that you can try, and many of them will not have those same issues that you were dealing with on those problem plants. So think about eliminating or relocating problem plants. For example, with that rose that may have had powdery mildew, maybe it had that disease because it was in too much shade. Roses don't like shade. They like to be in the full sun. So maybe if you just move that plant to a sunnier spot, that would eliminate the disease problem. But think about that kind of thing. Sometimes maybe you might have leaf scorch. Maybe you have some hostas that are getting burned up at the later part of the summer because they're in too much sun. Maybe you need to move those to a shadier spot and they will perform better for you even in the later part of the summer. Maybe you have a plant that's located at the end of a downspout and it's having trouble because its roots are constantly wet. It's ending up with root rot. Try moving that to a drier spot where you have really well-drained soil and put a plant in that area near the downspout that will tolerate soils that are consistently wet. And there are definitely plants to choose from that will do well under those conditions. So think about those problem plants and how you want to deal with those this year. And then think about any plants that have become excessively aggressive. A couple of plants that we get questions on a lot are trumpet vine and ribbon grass. They can be very pretty plants, but they can also be very aggressive, and they can take over and they can start spreading themselves around your landscape. And it can be a real headache to try to get rid of eventually. But you might want to think about trying to get rid of those plants if they're giving you problems. So fertilization of perennials. Generally, we don't want to use fertilizers that are very high in nitrogen when we're talking about our are perennials, because it tends to promote a lot of foliage growth at the expense of producing flowers and a good strong root system. Now, with our annual plants, we typically will use more high nitrogen fertilizers, but with perennials, we really want to have just a moderate level of nitrogen and more of the phosphorus. So adding fertilizer into your garden beds just as your plants are starting to get growing in spring can be a good time to make that application. So if you're starting a brand new bed, a brand new area, you might want to do some soil incorporation of about 2 to 2.5 pounds of a 5-10-5 per 100 square feet. Or if you have a already established garden, then you can side dress the plants. And what that means, side dressing, is sprinkling granules of fertilizer around the base of the root system of a plant, and then either irrigating it into the soil or lightly raking it into the soil and following that with some irrigation. So a side dress application of about 1/2 to 1 pound of 5-10-5 per 100 square feet would be sufficient for most perennial gardens. And honestly, it's not even necessary for you to really fertilize a perennial garden every year. If your plants are growing well, they've got nice sized flowers, they've got enough flowers, and the foliage color is the nice deep green that it should be, then your plants usually don't really need any additional fertilizer. But if you do fertilize, try to keep the fertilizer off the leaves, especially if we're in a hot or dry period, because the fertilizer itself could cause some scorching of that foliage. Okay, so one of your best friends when you're trying to care for a perennial garden is mulch. Mulch is going to do so many things for you. It's going to help hold moisture in the soil. It's going to help control weed growth and prevent the weeds from taking over in your garden. So mulch is really a good thing in a perennial garden. Typically, we're going to apply about 2 inches or so of a coarse organic mulch. And that could be something like, it could be shredded pine bark, it could be pine chips, it could be pine needle straw, could be just a shredded hardwood. Any of those kinds of things are fine to use as a mulch, okay? But in a perennial garden, we don't want to use landscape fabric. We don't want to put landscape fabric and then put mulch on top of it, because one of the purposes of our mulch is that as it breaks down, it's going to improve the underlying soil. It's going to add organic matter into that underlying soil and help make sure that our soil is good quality, has good aggregation. But if the landscape fabric is there, or plastic, which is in my mind even worse, that mulch is not going to be incorporating itself into the soil, which is not a good thing. So I would suggest you not use landscape fabric in perennial beds. Okay, so let's take a look at some different plants that you can choose from. And what I wanted you to see in this picture is that we have a beautiful plant in the front. This is a silver sage, which does have a flower, but it's really grown more for the color and the texture of the foliage than it is for any flowers that it would develop. This plant is generally not winter hardy in Nebraska. Now, it may live for a couple of years. I planted some in my gardens a few years ago, and it lived for about 2 years, and then it died out. But the leaves are so large, and they're covered with these hairs, these little white hairs. They're very soft leaves, but they give this really bold accent to a garden, just because of the size of the foliage in comparison to the size of most of the leaves of most other plants in your garden. They have a beautiful textural contrast that they bring to a garden. So this is silver sage. All right. Now, as you're putting your plants together in your gardens, of course, we always want to consider these basic growing requirements of plants. What is the soil type and the pH of the soil? What is the moisture availability of the soil? Is it well drained? Does it tend to stay wet? You really want to keep those things in mind as you're choosing plants. What is the sun exposure? Is it going to be morning sun and afternoon shade? Or is it going to be the opposite? Is it going to be morning shade and afternoon sun? The afternoon sun is much brighter and more intense, and you really need to have plants that are adapted to that sun to do well there. How much sun? I'm constantly asking people, well, how many hours of direct sun a day are your plants getting? And with a full sun plant, they're going to want probably a minimum of 6 hours of full sun a day. If it's a plant that will tolerate partial shade to shade, you may be able to get away with either dappled shade or maybe even just a couple hours of full sun a day. Okay. Then what about wind? Some of our plants are very, very easily scorched when they're in high winds, especially if they have big leaves. And so we may need to provide them a little bit of wind protection for them to really grow and be their most attractive. Okay. Elevation. If you have low parts of your landscape, especially at this time in the spring, we know that cold air drains down to the lowest level that it can find. And so those plants in the low areas are more likely to get nipped by a late spring frost that may occur. So you're going to want to locate plants that are more tender at higher elevations in your landscape so that they're not sitting down in those pockets where you may get really cold temperatures at night, so that they don't get nipped. And then a big one to think about, okay, is what is the mature size of that plant? If you're looking at an ironweed, which is a native plant that a lot of people may think about adding to a garden because it's great for pollinators and butterflies. Some of our ironweeds can get really tall, over 10 feet tall. So what is the mature size of that plant? And that's going to help you figure out where to place it so that you can really enjoy it to its best advantage. And so that you can create a look in your landscape that's attractive, that you enjoy. Okay. Also think about these particular aspects of design. What are the forms of your plants? Now in this landscape, we have a variety of different forms. We have some grasses and some upright plants in the back, which are giving us an upright vertical accent in this landscape. Then we have some rounded bushy things here on the sides, like these cone flowers. And I believe that these are a daisy of some kind. I can't see them well enough, but they're giving us kind of a rounded bushy form. Then we have some low spreading forms. We've got some lamb's ear here in the front. We've got some sedum here, which is also low and spreading. If you're talking about a container, you might want to also have something that was trailing or creeping down the sides to give that nice kind of trailing effect. Again, what are the texture of the leaves? Here we have, again, a nice textural contrast with the leaves of these lamb's ear compared to the fine texture of the foliage of this grass and the fine textured leaves of this yarrow. Okay. And then of course, bloom sequence. That's one of the things we focus on quite a lot because we want to have some color in our gardens from spring all the way to fall. So as you're looking at plants, consider, okay, what is the season of the year when they're going to be blooming so that you can make sure that you have a nice balance of colors throughout the year. All right, let's look first at some annuals. And I have to say, I only threw in a couple of annual plants. I really wanted to focus a little more of our attention today on perennials that you might choose for your gardens. So if you watched the earlier presentation that we did last week, I talked about this plant Angelonia, or summer snapdragon. And here you can see a nice close-up picture of what these the flower heads look like on summer snapdragon. And again, they come in a variety of heights. There are some that are in the 8-inch height range, some that are about 10 to 12 inch. So you can get a variety of heights in these. Now they make a great cut flower, just as snapdragons do. So if you're wanting to grow a cut flower garden, this would be a good one to include. But the thing that I really like about summer snapdragon is that it's very easy to grow. It's not very picky about soil type, and it will grow in most soils in Nebraska. It's easy to get it started. It likes full sun. Once its roots have become established, it's quite heat and drought tolerant. And as you cut off those flower spikes, new flower spikes will continually develop all summer long. And actually, as you cut off flower spikes, you'll get more and more stems developing, and the plant will get bushier and bushier. So you'll end up with even more in number of flower spikes as well. but it's a very showy plant, brings a lot of color from the annual perspective into a flower garden. Okay, and here is Angelonia Serena Lavender Pink, and you can see we have a little bit different coloration to this one. Okay, here we've used it in a container where we have the Angelonia as our vertical upright accent in this container. And we actually have two different colors. We have one called Blanket White, and we have one called Angel Mist Purple. Okay, or excuse me, I got those names wrong. Angel Mist Purple, and then Purple Stripe is right here. The Petunia Blanket White, that is this one in front. The Petunia are our small little petunia flowers. Then we have a Tradescantia, which is a little hard to see, but it's these darker purple leaves that you see here in the middle. And then we have a Centaurea, which is this beautiful silver foliage here in the middle of the container. But again, all of those plants that are listed in this container would do just as well in a ground bed. So you could have, clustered masses of your Angelonia together, mixed in with the Centaurea, and then have the Petunia as your ground cover that's going to trail along the ground. And those plants would all look very, very nice in a ground bed. Okay, so I also wanted to talk a little bit about Calibrachoa. And if you have never heard that name, these are plants that are very closely related to petunias. In fact, they used to be botanically lumped into the genus Petunia, but they have been broken out into their own genus now, which is called Calibrachoa. Or Million Bells was the name of a popular series that was available early on. And it got that name because of the number of flowers. As you can see in the picture on the lower right, Calibrachoa, when they're in full bloom, can just be covered with flowers. And even though the flowers are small, there are so many of them that they just really bring a lot of color into a garden. But they are viners, so they work well as a low ground cover type of a plant. And they'll just kind of trail along the ground and cover the area of the garden where you would like some color. They come in an amazing variety of colors and bicolors. It's just pretty much any color that you want, there is a Calibrachoa that you can find in that color. Okay. And then I also mentioned this plant in our earlier program, or group of plants, I should say, and that is Coleus. Just the fact that there are so many beautiful Coleus varieties available to us now, and there are some that do well in the shade, and there are a lot of them that do well in full sun too. So we don't have to save Coleus for just the shade locations anymore. Here in this container, we've got a blend of 6 different types of Coleus, and these plants would look nice as a grouping in a ground bed in a garden as well. So even without any flowers or any really significant flowers, you can create a very striking, eye-catching burst of color in a garden by just using varieties of Coleus. Okay, and here we see Coleus mixed in a container. Here we have Calibrachoa Cabaret Apricot. We've got a Pennisetum rubrum, or a red Pennisetum. We have a Petunia Suncatcher Deep Plum. We've got Nemesia Bluebird off to the side. We've got Calibrachoa Cabaret Apricot. And then we've got Ageratum Artist Purple here on the side. Okay. So as I said, just a couple of perennials, or excuse me, a couple of annuals that I wanted to focus on because there have been some advancements with these particular plants in recent years, and they're definitely worth considering either for containers or for ground bed plantings. But let's focus the rest of our time now on perennials because there are so many great perennials to choose from. Here in this picture, I wanted to show you this purplish colored foliage is actually a kale. This is actually an ornamental kale. Now, these are completely edible too. So if you wanted to harvest the leaves off of some of these kale plants and use them in the kitchen for cooking, you certainly could. But you can see what a beautiful accent they make in a fall garden when you combine them with some beautiful chrysanthemums, and then we have a pretty ornamental grass at their back. and the ornamental kale really shines. Okay, so let's start off with plants that are going to be standouts in the spring garden. And this is a planting for partial sun to shade. And so what we have in this particular planting are bleeding heart, which are a very old-fashioned type of flower. And this is bleeding heart right here with these purple heart-shaped flowers that hang down below these arching stems. And bleeding heart is a very easy plant to grow. It loves it does fine with morning sun, but it would prefer afternoon shade. They come up early in the spring. They're one of the first plants to emerge from the ground. They'll be blooming in probably about another 3 weeks. And then by the end of June, the plants may just fade out, especially if they're in a very dry location. But if you keep them well watered, the foliage will stay and grow throughout the rest of the summer. Okay. Now here in the back with the blue flowers, we have Virginia bluebells or Martensia. And Virginia bluebells are kind of a fun plant in that the flower buds before they open are pink. And then when they open up, the flowers are blue. And so you have kind of a bicolor effect with Virginia bluebells in the garden. But they would do just great, as you can see, in a planting with something like bleeding heart. And then down here in the lower left-hand corner, we have some hosta. We have a pretty bicolored hosta leaf that's white and green. And all of those do very, very well in a partial sun area of the landscape. Okay. So now here is a plant grouping for a full sun area. Now this is kind of late spring or early summer. This would be about, I would say, end of May into the first part of June. But what we have here is a yellow wild indigo right here in the front, a Baptesia, and this particular cultivar is called Screamin' Yellow. So typically Baptesias are blue or white, with blue being the more predominant color. But this particular Baptesia is this beautiful yellow color. And Baptesias are very hardy. They grow very well in Nebraska landscapes. And you'll have it there for many, many years. When the spears start to come up in the spring, the spears of Baptesia almost look like asparagus. So if you're not familiar with them, you might be fooled the first year when it starts to grow again. Now the plant here in the middle area is Catmint. This is Nepeta Walker's Low. And this particular perennial was a perennial of the year, according to the Perennial Plant Association of the United States. And it's a very, very nice catmint or a Nepeta. And you'll have this beautiful flush of foliage in the late spring, early summer. Then if you cut those flower stems back after the flowers have faded, you'll get another flush of flower stems that will come up, and you'll have more flowers in about a month or so later. And the same is true for this ornamental sage. So the dark purple flowers you see in the background, this is my favorite cultivar of ornamental sage, and it's called Cardona. I like this one because it's very upright, and the stems don't flop down on the ground. I kind of hate it when perennials do that in my garden. I like them to stand up the way they're supposed to stand up. And Cardona does that, especially if it's in a good full sun area. And just as I mentioned with the catmint a minute ago, you'll get this first flush of flowers is very colorful. And then when those are done, if you cut that foliage back, it will send up a new cluster of flowering shoots, and you'll have more flower later in the summer. Okay, so now here we are about midsummer. This is a garden for midsummer in the full sun. And in the lower part of this picture, we have some beautiful coneflowers. So those are the pink flowers, the pink daisy-like flowers with the prominent central cone. This happens to be a cultivar called Magnus. There are many, many different cultivars of coneflowers to choose from, and they can be pink or orangey or yellowish. There is a variety that was popular a few years ago called Indian Summer, and it was a blend of colors. And excuse me, I think I got that wrong. I think it's Cheyenne Summer. And it was beautiful because you don't have one single color. You have a blend of colors that comes in with that particular cultivar. Then in the middle of this planting, we have these beautiful red flowers. And this is Monarda or Bee Balm. This happens to be a cultivar called Jacob Klein. And this is a great cultivar because the Monardas tend to be somewhat prone to powdery mildew, especially if they're not in full sun. But Jacob Klein is a cultivar that is very, very resistant to powdery mildew. So you hardly ever see that problem. And all of the plants in this picture, in fact, the coneflowers, the bee balm, and the heliopsis, all of these are great plants for butterflies and pollinators. So if you're trying to either create a cutting garden or you're wanting to create a garden to attract more butterflies and pollinators, any of these plants would be a good choice. Then the bright kind of buttery yellow plants that we see in the background, this is a heliopsis, or a sunflower heliopsis is the common name for that particular plant. And usually the heliopsis are kind of an orangey yellow color like this. There are some that are taller and some cultivars which are shorter. So if you need a more of a compact cultivar to choose for your garden, either because you have a small garden or just because you want to put it more toward the front of your perennial border, there are some options to choose from there. But all of these are great perennials, very easy to grow, and they do really, really well in those full sun areas. All right. So here is another planting for full sun, but here we have some more annuals added in. And so here we have a zinnia, Splendor Pink is the name of this one. And then we have an ageratum, Blue Horizon, in the background. The ageratum houstoniums are some of the taller ageratums. So they tend to get, up in the 12 to 18 inch height range. And so Zinnia elegans is a great annual plant that you can grow from seed, or you can plant it from transplants. Another Zinnia series that I might suggest that you check into is called the Profusion series. And there are a number of colors. There's a white, an orange, a pink, a red in the Profusion Zinnia series. What I like about them is that as the flowers come out, they come out beyond where the old growth and the old flowers were located. So you don't have to do a lot of deadheading because the new flowers kind of hide the old flowers. And as these Profusion Zinnias plants are very well branched, and they tend to develop a nice bushy little plant. And you'll just have continuous color throughout the whole summer. And they do great in either containers or in ground bed plantings. Okay, so now here we are back with some more perennials for full sun. And so the yellow flowers that you see in the front are a tick seed coreopsis, or Coreopsis grandiflora. And then in the back, we have a bellflower, or a campanula. This happens to be clustered bellflower. Now, there are many, many different cultivars to choose from among both of these plants, both the Coreopsis and the campanula. And there are different bicolors, different color ranges. So as a group, though, these are very, very good perennial plants for Nebraska gardens, quite hardy. And, once they're well established, they'll be pretty drought resistant. So again, more great plants for that full sun area. Okay. Now, sometimes you don't really have the opportunity to enjoy your gardens much during the daytime. And one strategy that you could use to be able to enjoy your garden at night is to create a white garden. And so here we have a garden that's made up of primarily white flowers that would really stand out and be showy even at dusk or at night. If you were out sitting on a back deck or a back patio, you could enjoy these plants in your garden. So the tall plant that you have in the back is called Culver's root, or Veronica Virginica. And it does tend to get tall. So you would want to make sure that you check out the size range on Culver's root before you plant it to make sure that you have a garden that's big enough to accommodate it. Then the bushy flowers to the right are garden phlox. And garden phlox is a great perennial that tends to get to be about 18 to 24 inches tall. And it has these great big heads made up of many little flowers. Now, just as I mentioned a moment ago with the Jacob Klein Monarda, garden phlox or the David cultivar is a great one in particular to grow because it's also very resistant to powdery mildew, which tends to be a pest that we see on garden phlox quite often. But David is quite resistant to powdery mildew, and so it performs very well in most Nebraska gardens. And then the final plant that we have is down here in the lower front, the lower left, and that is an Artemisia or a white sage. And this particular cultivar is called Silver Queen. Now we have some Artemisias that are very low growing ground covers, and then we have some that are more upright. And the Silver Queen is more upright, and it will get to be a taller plant, up into that 24 to possibly even 36-inch height range. But together, these plants would create that beautiful white background that you could enjoy in a garden, even into the evening hours. Okay. So here we wanted to look at some daisies. And so we have a cluster of different daisy plants to look at. The white flowers in the background are Shasta daisy, or Leucanthemum is their botanical name right now. Leucanthemum superbum. And then in the middle, we have another coneflower. And then in the very front, we have a black-eyed Susan, and this is a Rudbeckia cultivar called Goldstrum. We see this particular cultivar in the garden centers quite often. It's very popular these days. And it will start blooming typically around the beginning part of June, and then it will bloom all summer until the plants die in the fall. So here we have a beautiful accent created in a garden with 3 different daisy type flowers. Okay. All right, let's look at a few for fall then. As we move out of the summer garden and into the fall garden, what we have in this picture that I want to point out first is this is called garden sedum or tall sedum. We have some sedums that are very short ground cover plants, and then we have some like this, which are taller. So the tall sedums tend to get to be about 18 to 24 inches tall, and they usually start to bloom around mid to end of September, I would say. And I have some tall sedums in my landscape at home, and when they are blooming, they are covered with butterflies. Butterflies and bees and other pollinators simply love these plants. And there are actually quite a few different cultivars of tall sedum to choose from. This is one called Autumn Joy, which is very popular. There are some that have dark maroon colored foliage, and there are others that have different colored flower heads. Some are more of a kind of a salmon color. And then, there are a lot of different tall sedums to choose from. But I would definitely consider tall sedum for its beautiful color in the fall garden and for its great attraction to butterflies and pollinators. And then we also have a couple of ornamental grasses that are mixed in with this planting. So we have, and it's a little hard to see them because they're in the back, but here in the back we have Calibrachoa, a Carl Forster, which is a beautiful ornamental grass. One of the things I love about Carl Forster, again, is that it has a very vertical, upright nature, whereas some of our ornamental grasses can tend to kind of flap open a little bit in mid to late summer. Carl Forster stands up very nicely, and it even gives you some beautiful foliage effects in the wintertime if you let it stand over the winter. And then we have, closest to us here in the front, we have feathergrass, or Stipa gigantea. So we can get some beautiful effects in our gardens with some of the ornamental grasses too, especially in the fall. So more plants to give you some fall color. Here we have in the front a New York aster. This happens to be an aster called Woods Purple. And of course, our asters really come into their own in the fall when they burst into bloom and bring some new color to the garden. But then here again, we have Rudbeckia Goldstrom right behind it, which is still blooming. It's been blooming all summer. And now it's providing a nice backdrop to this New York aster, which is showing up really well against the yellow flowers of the Black-Eyed Susan. Okay. And I think this is my last picture to show you. These are two of my new favorite plants for a fall garden. The yellow flowers in the background, you might not realize what that is when you first look at it, but that is actually a goldenrod. It's a goldenrod called Wichita Mountain, and it's quite different from most of the goldenrods that we see, especially those that grow along the roadsides in Nebraska, the common goldenrod. This is a variety that actually developed naturally on its own, and it has stems and flower spikes that remind me very much of liatris or gay feather, if you're familiar with that plant. And you have many, many tiny little flowers that develop all along the length of this flower head. And so you have a bush that tends to develop into a nice, strong bush that will get to be about 3 feet or maybe even a little over 3 feet tall. And then in the fall, you'll have all of these beautiful goldenrod flowers when they start to bloom. And at the same time that the Wichita Mountain is blooming, that is also the time when some of our fall blooming anemones are just bursting into flower. So the pink flower that you see in the lower picture is a fall blooming anemone called Robustissima. And it has these beautiful pink flowers with yellow stamens around the center of the flower. And I just love seeing these plants together in my fall garden because they just bring some new life and fresh color and fresh foliage when my garden is looking a little bit tired at the end of September. And these plants really bring some beautiful attractiveness to that garden in the late part of the summer. So I would really encourage you, if you have a full to partial sun location, to try the hybrid anemone. And the goldenrod Wichita Mountains really prefers full sun. So I would try to find a good sunny spot where you could put that. Okay. So again, Robin, we just have some limited time here today, but there are so many beautiful perennials to choose from. It's just a matter of learning about them and where they fit best in your landscapes. And I hope that this gives some folks some ideas of some new plants that they might want to try in their gardens this year.
Sarah, thank you so much. This was great information that really kind of has me excited now for what I can do outside when the planting season begins. So that is my one and only question today, and that is, when does planting season begin for us, and when must it end?
So with annuals and perennials, the perennials are pretty cold tolerant, but typically they're coming out of a greenhouse that has been, kept at pretty warm temperatures. I would not get too excited about putting a lot of plants in the ground until about the first part of May. We get cabin fever so much over the winter. We just want to get out there in our gardens as early as we can, but we still have a pretty high potential for freezing nights even in April. So it's better if you wait toward the end of April, first week in May, to get started with putting your annuals and your perennials in the ground. And then, when does the garden season end? Well, for most of our annuals, it ends when we have a frost that kills those plants, and then it'll be time to take them out. But some of our perennials, like the last two that I mentioned, can keep going strong. And so they may not be done until, into October, and then finally be killed by a very hard frost.
Okay, great. Sarah, I've enjoyed our time together. I've learned a lot. I've got lots of notes, page notes that tells me what you just said. And again, all the pictures were beautiful to help me understand what the different color ranges are that we could plant here in Nebraska. So again, thank you for spending time with us. ARP has truly appreciated your knowledge.
My pleasure.
And I want to tell everybody watching us today that if they've enjoyed today's session, please be sure to follow us on Facebook, like this post, or even share it on your page to let others know what you have learned. Thank you for being with us.